Hello, everyone. I'm here to interview Roger about his upcoming book, Valley of Death.
Yes, I've got two books coming out in a very short succession: The Valley of Death and The Bible of Hell. They're part of a trilogy of retrospective crime thrillers that, in a sense, tries to do for the corrupt underbelly and criminal underbelly of British politics in a specific period of time what James Ellroy's Underworld trilogy did for American politics. Of course, his trilogy began in 1963 with the Kennedy assassination and moved through to the Watergate period and the assassination, as he interpreted it, of J. Edgar Hoover. It's a jury is out of what really happened, but he dealt with that period of American history through the lens of a noir crime novel. And in a sense, I've tried to do the same thing with the period from 1984 more 1985, which is the second year of the miners' strike, when the possibility of a general strike had already been basically lost, and in through to 1988. A lot of it's prefaced around the Gibraltar assassinations, and looks at the decline of British democracy in that period, the role of a deep state paedophile ring within that, and looks at that within the context of a crime novel. I'm heavily influenced, I've already mentioned James Ellroy, obviously also by David Peace, and with his Red Riding Quartet, and with Jake Arnott with his trilogy that ends with true crime, but also to a very large extent by Scandinavian noir, and particularly by Stieg Larsson, whose Millennium trilogy began with The Girl in the Dragon Tattoo. So it's very much in that cultural milieu, but dealing with the British situation from 1980 and with some flashback to the 1970s onwards. It's mostly set in South Wales. Some of it's set in London. The sequel is set in South Wales, London and Spain. We'll explain why in a bit. But yeah, you want to ask me some questions about
definitely.
The book?
So that time period is during the miners' strike.
Yes.
And so what does the story sort of tell us about the miners' strike?
Well, okay, let's start with what actually happens during this. It's a fictional story, but founded in fact. And in a town in southwest Wales, the Rhondda Valley, which is actually based on a town called Treorchy, there is a murderer, a serial killer, basically hunting down and murdering young girls who are activists in support of the miners' strike, mostly university students, but with connect with mining families. And he calls himself Azazel, after one of the 9 fallen angels that are aligned with Satan in the based on the book of Enoch, but also in Milton's Paradise Lost. The guy's clearly mad, but he obviously knows something about deep state conspiracies. Every one of these girls is a sexual conquest of a charismatic but highly corrupt Trotskyist leader called Liam O'Leary, who I think we could safely say, since the bugger is dead, is based on Jerry Healey of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, of which I was a member in the 1980s, the largest Trotskyist group in the UK at that time, a party which should have been capable of providing revolutionary leadership during the strike, which was failed to do so, I believe, because Healey was being sexually compromised. The deep state knew about his abuse of young women. It's speculation whether there was any link between that and the deep state paedophile operation operating in Britain at that time, but in this story there is. And so you've got a miners' strike being screwed over by a bogus revolutionary leadership, the consequences of which are the actual defeat of the working class movement in this country. If you consider the kind of dystopian nightmare we've been living in since the 1980s, it is largely down to the fact that the British Labour movement was defeated. When I was a young journalist and trade union member during the miners' strike, when I was Mabeen's age or very slightly older, I believe the revolution was around the corner, and we lived with the consequences of that ever since. In the storyline, to keep with what the story's about, one of the protagonists is actually a copper called Terry Vaughan, whose father is dying of silicosis, is an ex-miner. His brother is an activist in the Revolutionary Workers' League, which is a fictionalised version of the WIP, so he has very much has divided loyalties. His family have tried to get him to resign for the police force. As a detective, he's not involved in crushing the strike in any way, but his brother calls him a scab. He's alienated from his own family. He's got a young wife, she's pregnant, blah, 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 blah. And, of course, Johnny, his brother, is absolutely besotted of this guy called Zach Miller, who's an ex-soap opera heartthrob. Was as you know, there are a lot of members of Equity in the old WIP. He is actually a full-time activist in the RWEL. But is he playing for Roy? Is he actually the killer? Who is the killer? What does the killer want to tell us? And eventually, what happens is we find the killer is an ex-state assassin who was involved in the military coup plot against Harold Wilson. Who knows about the deep state paedophile ring that included the involvement of Jimmy Savile? We find out that he worked as a psychiatric nurse actually at Stoke Mandeville at the same time that Jimmy Savile was there in the second book. And he's basically sending these cryptic messages out to the police and to the media, basically saying, I know what you people have done. Now, poor old Terry, his immediate superior, is a corrupt cop called Detective Chief Inspector Ridgway, ex-Flying Squad, ex-Metropolitan Police, left London under a cloud, still involved with the Freemasons, still connected to this cabal of cops who we discovered did two things. One, they were involved in covering up the murder of Vishal, the young Asian lad, we fictionalised their name, who was murdered in Dolphin Square in 1982, the same year as the royal wedding, as part of a blackmail operation to control British politics. The people set up to carry out the murder was Cyril Smith and Granville Janner, both later, without doubt, paedophiles. The one undermining the Lib Lab coalition that made sure that Labour lost the election to Margaret Thatcher, and the second one more sinisterly involved in what became the right-wing leadership succession in the Tory party, in the Labour Party. It might as well be a Tory party now, and the basically, the paedophile ring was about using political blackmail. I believe it really existed. Some of the facts have actually been slightly fictionalised. One, either to stop me being sued, and also because some of it's guesswork, and for reasons of chronology, you have some things happening in the 1980s that really happened in the 1990s, but to make the story work as a narrative, it's been chopped around a bit. The criminal cabal within the police force, incidentally, that Ridgway, fictional character, created for the great actor Phil Davis. If ever he wants to play the role, I'd love to hear from him. He is actually also involved with setting up the Brinks-Mat robbery, and so therefore, of course, he's linked to someone called Whelan, who some people think bears a certain resemblance to Kenny Noy. Discovers about the paedophile network, and in the later episodes, his mate, Diamond Bob Dayton, who I can safely say is based on John Goldfinger Palmer, enabled him to blackmail the paedophile ring and come to a sorry end. So that's the story.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't want to spoil too much of it.
But that's as much spoiler alert as I dare do. You know what I mean?
But could you tell us who the murderer is based on?
Yes, I can. I can't give his name because I don't want to be sued by the bugger. But if I give these things out, people know. I, as a journalist, actually working with a police contact who later got forced to resign from the police due to ill health, surprise, surprise, we basically tracked down who the murderer of Hilda Murrell was in 1985. She was an anti-nuclear activist who was actually... Well, the reason I believe... I've talked to her nephew, but the reason I believe she was murdered is that I think that incorrectly the deep state thought that her nephew, who was in naval intelligence, had provided her with details about the sinking of the Belgrano as it left the exclusion zone in the Falklands, leading to the Falklands War at a time when the Peruvian government had almost got together a deal to avert the war altogether. People old enough will remember, or people interested in history will know, that the Admiral Belgrano was sunk as they left the exclusion zone. She was already under surveillance from the nuclear police and their subcontractors, because she was an anti-nuclear activist involved in the campaign against Brinkley C. I think it was Brinkley Seas, that's right. She lived in Shropshire. The surveillance was subcontracted by MI5 and the nuclear police to both Zeus Security in Norwich, and through them to an organisation called Sapphire Investigations, actually in Shrewsbury itself. Sapphire Investigations had a very, very, very controversial recent history at that time. They had compiled dossiers on left-wing activists for the National Front and regularly used fascists for doing their dirty work, one of whom was the guy who I call Azazel, who, together with two other guys, one of whom is now deceased and was involved with the deep state paedophile ring in the care homes in North Wales, basically were instructed to go into her house, break into her safe and find out what information she had. They were not told to murder her, I don't believe, but that she discovered them and they killed her. Now, the young lad who ended up getting convicted decades later for her murder, Andrew George, was 17 years old at the time and was a victim of abuse within the care home system. Now, Rob Green, who is actually Hilda Murrell's nephew, who I've spoken to, I've never physically met him, lives in New Zealand, he's written a book on the subject. He thinks that Andrew George was framed. So does his lawyer, who is actually Michael Mansfield. Now, I think the jury's out, I don't know, but he could not have committed the crime alone. 17 years old, didn't have the technical ability to disable her phone, and didn't know how to drive a car. She was dumped in a field miles away. So there was definitely a wider conspiracy in the murder of Hilda Murrell. And originally, when I talked to was it Peter Rhodes, the editor of the Wolverhampton Express and Star, he was very, very critical of this. No, he believed the police, basically, until I pointed out the one or two things I've just mentioned. 17-year-old, victim of care abuse, didn't have the technical skills, XYZ. Andrew George might have been there, he might not have been there, I don't know, but he could not have committed that crime alone. And over the years, me and a police contact whose name I can't disclose, we did a bit of research on this character, and we found out the member of Colin Jordan's colour guard within the British movement, or the National Socialist movement that became the British movement, that led to the creation of Combat 18, Column 88, which is widely believed to have been a creation of MI5. He was doing these odd jobs and dirty work for the deep state, for the secret world. In the novel, he's involved in the assassination both of Airey Neave and of Lord Lucan, but I may have committed a bit of poetic license there, the reason for it being apparent later on. But what we do know for a fact is that by the 1990s, when he was working at a number of, he worked, for example, at a psychiatric institution in Hereford. At the time that he murdered Hilda Murrell, he was safe-housed at an MI5 safe-housed in Fife. He was in Scotland at the time when his name, McCree, the SNP member of Parliament, was assassinated. Willie McCree, he was at Stoke Mandeville when Jimmy Savile worked there, and he really was the only member of the Combat 18 leadership to actually escape conviction for a conspiracy of murder in 1995-1996, when Charlie Sargent and other fascists were sent down for conspiracy of murder, which made me and my contact fairly confident that this guy was a state asset, rather interestingly, and we kind of bend the rules in the second novel to take things out of sequence. The same person converted to Islam after 9/11 and started trying to apply some kind of warped Nazi ideology to Islamic fundamentalists and Salafist groups. He tried to approach, Hamas. I don't think he got very far. But he tried it, which again reeks of deep state involvement. So this guy really exists, and if he's out there, he knows why I've identified him. Just join the dots, read the novel, then compare it with things like, for example, was Sue Cook's book, factual book on the murder of Hilda Morrell, and it won't take you very long to find out who Azazel really is.
Exciting. What does?
Oh, my contact, by the way, she was fitted up for drunk driving and forced to retire through ill health.
What does the novel tell us about the WRP and democratic centralism?
Well, it tells us that the WRP was a corrupt institution by this time. I believe that, I think I know that through his, we don't know if he actually was directly linked to the paedophile operations. For example, I don't think he was ever at Dolphin Square. He may have been at South Vale, however, where, of course, his name, Ted Knight was actually head of the Lambeth Council. He was in the WRP, and that happened on his watch. He was a sleeper inside the Labour Party. But we know that basically an organisation of that size, given the number of spy cops that there were within the left at that time, and given the role of the F branch of MI5 under Steiner Remington, and given the role of Brian Crozier and his role that he performed for the Thatcher government, that the state must have known what Healey was. They must have known that he was an abuser of young women, just as they knew that the corrupt money was coming in from Libya and various other dodgy autocracies. And I think that when the chips were down, they used that to pressure Healey to basically screw up what could have been a decisive moment for the working class movement, when, given the WRP's influence in the GLC in particular, the fact that you had the era Ken Livingstone, the fact that Corinne Redgrave and Alex Mitchell were on the editorial board of London Herald with Ted Knight, given that they had the ear of Arthur Scargill, given that Dave Temple was running the Durham NUM, and in the end, of course, the Miner, the paper that ended up with an editor from WRP. We know that there was a botched opportunity to link the Miner strike to the struggle to save the metropolitan councils, and Margaret Thatcher herself later admitted to Stern magazine that in fact she said if those two struggles had been combined, her government would have fallen. Now, as to the mechanics of how that works, I mean, we've got Zach as a fictional character, being a member of Healey's security directorate, pimping for him openly. That's a fictional character, but we know that something like that went on. We know that the main purpose of the security directorate was to police and intimidate WRP members rather than to fight fascists or defend it from the party from attack, and also to pimp girls. Not that every member of the directorate was involved in that, but to pimp girls for Jerry Healey. And what was interesting is that at the time of, from the time basically almost that the SLR became the WRP, Alex Mitchell was the editor of the daily newsline Financer and Middle Eastern Money. You know, you could buy it in news agents. It was always on sales. That sold out football matches. That sold out every strike you could imagine. It was the first colour tabloid in the UK, even before, it was long before it became the normal practice to have colour tabloids, quite slickly produced. And the whole thing about Alex Mitchell and his operation was that it was kept completely separate from the rest of the party. And the only person who had regular contact with Mitchell was Jerry Healey. On the very day that Healey and his entourage were expelled from the leadership of the WRP and that was a third of the Central Committee were booted out. Alex Mitchell got a job with Rupert Murdoch down in Australia. He was Australian anyway. He was a hitherto editor at World in Action. I'm fairly convinced, I'm going to say this way, I think Alex Mitchell was a state agent because all the evidence points towards it. But Healey was so easy to manipulate. A lot of people thought he'd been fitted up, like the Red Grouse said, he was framed, he wasn't a sexual predator. Yes, he was. Ken Livingstone came out with a very similar book because they were good mates. But I think that generally the WIP lent itself to that level of manipulation through, one, the degree of paranoia that existed within the organisation, and the book drips with paranoia, and also because of a very strict and regimented interpretation of democratic centralism, about which I have some reservations, some me and you moments. But it's interesting, I find it interesting that 20 years later, in the Socialist Workers' Party in the early 2000s, you get a woman accusing one of the leadership of sexual abuse. They have a kangaroo court in which she can't even get evidence, followed by victim blaming, where she's described as being sexually promiscuous and bringing it on herself. Now, it's not the same magnitude as what happened to the WIP. And quite frankly, I don't think the SWP have anyone in their ranks capable of beating people up. But it smells of the same kind of problem. And the SWP's argument against that, well, we've got safeguards in place now. Were the people on the Central Committee who covered that up, were they expelled? No, I don't think so. And to me, it suggests that there's more of a structural problem with democratic centralism than simply the WIP going wrong. We know, we know Frank Ferrudi's outfit was a state operation from day one, but it was still using that template. And it makes me worried about democratic centrist parties and allergic to rejoining them. There are two democratic centrist parties in London that I have regular dealings with, mainly through my friend here, with the Revolutionary Communist Party, not to be confused with the one under Farage, but also with Workers' Power. And I have no intentions of joining either.
That may change one day, though. I'm sure.
I know you're very persuasive, but so am I.
Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
I think we'll stay on topic though for today. What evidence is there of a deep state pedophile ring operating in the UK, and what's its relationship to the military coup attempt or plans for a military coup under? Well,
I'm glad you mentioned that, because as far as I can make out, the paedophile ring in the form that we understand it, I do think that the evidence is overwhelming, and I've actually talked to one of Cecil King's victims. Cecil King, I better explain who that was. Cecil King in the 1960s was the proprietor of the Daily Mirror before Robert Maxwell, but also a governor of the Bank of England who was vehemently opposed to Harold Wilson's devaluation of the pound, thought the trade union movement were too powerful, yawn, and also basically contrived a military coup plot to overthrow Wilson's government and replace it with what he called a businessman's government, in which various coup plotters who'd moved from the military and the intelligence community into like what we call strategic industries. They were involved in banking, the arms industry, the media, bring them into a government established by a military coup that wasn't elected, just put these business people into government. A bit like what Nigel Farage wants now, actually. In fact, Nigel Farage's plans for government are a facsimile of Cecil King's. But Cecil King was a paedophile himself. I've talked to a guy who I know for a fact is a victim. He was a victim of Cecil King. Cecil King's pimp was Jimmy Savile, who has subsequently been framed as a lone sexual predator who simply exploited a position of abuse. This is crap. Jimmy Savile pimped for this movement. In 1967, another DJ from the pirate radio era was murdered by the Krays because he got wind of what Savile was up to. There were two plots. There was one in 1968, which came very shortly after Cecil King purchased Encounter magazine, which was a CIA front within the British Labour movement. From the CIA, he was regularly in contact with Bissell, who was the CIA director at that time, and the coup plot came to nothing. It was very kind of frivolous. He'd promised that a government that replaced Howard would get involved in the War of Vietnam and all so on and so forth. But it didn't really come to nothing. By the 1970s, you had open class warfare, and the establishment are listening to Cecil King much more seriously than they were during the 1960s. All of a sudden, thanks to Brian Crozier and Forum World Features, which was backed by the CIA, you've got Cecil King giving lectures to the British military, particularly military intelligence, and advocating a military coup quite openly. This followed the mutiny of the British Army during the UWC strike in the north of Ireland in 1974, and of course through the fact that Jimmy Savile pimped for Lord Mountbatten, he was brought into the military coup plot to give it a royal stamp of approval. Privy Council make it look semi-legal, even though putting tanks on the streets and removing the Prime Minister isn't what I would call legal. And of course, what happened? The worst thing that happened was in 1975-76, William Colby was replaced as CIA director by George H.W. Bush, who was a very different. And basically went to see Wilson and said, "Look, if you don't retire," this was at number 10 Downing Street. "If you don't retire, we will support a military coup." After the coup plot ended, Mountbatten and also Lord Lucan became loose ends, because Lucan thought he was going to be the Fuhrer of Britain that needed to be got rid of. Wilson, of course, had his pile in Sligo, where he regularly abused young boys who were trafficked down from the Kincora Boys' Home, and he was assassinated, supposedly by Irish Republicans, on the same day as their attack on the Marines in the paratroop regiment. Sorry, again, we'll have to do this. Very famous attack, Warren Point, and the Warren Point attack, which from the IRA's point of view was a huge ideological. It was the same regiment involved in Bloody Sunday. All their resources went into it. The IRA did it. We have no doubt about it. We even know who the quartermaster was. It was a guy called John Slad Murphy. We know that's an IRA operation. No one claimed responsibility for the killing of Mountbatten, and even the INLA didn't claim responsibility, though it's since been attached to them. Now, I think that the deep state killed Mountbatten. I think the IRA would not at that time have attacked a member of the royal family in the Republic, because there was a kind of agreement between Lance Fianna Fáil and Irish Army intelligence and the provost that they didn't commit too high profile a terrorist attack in the Irish Republic, that they wouldn't come down on them too hard. That changed in the 80s, but in the 70s, that was very much the gig. And you don't get much more high profile than killing a member of the royal family. So, no, there's no way the IRA did that. And of course, a few months later, or was it before, Erin Eve was killed. Now, Erin Eve had been briefed about the child sex abuse taking place at the Kincora Boys' Home in that same year, 1979. And then Erin Eve gets killed in the car park of the House of Commons with a highly sophisticated bomb that uses a mercury switch attached to the engine. Now that's a trick that's well known with British Special Forces, SAS, SPS. It's standard technique for them. They used it a lot in Aden. The IRA never, and the INLA in particular, never mastered that technology. And when Dominic McClinchy told Roger Bolton of BBC News that the INLA had carried out the assassination, this is an INLA that's a busted flush by this time. He got the details wrong. He thought the bomb had been put under the car seat, so that wasn't him. By that time, by the late 1970s, early 80s, the paedophile ring had been shifted. Its resources had been shifted towards manipulating politics, making sure Margaret Thatcher got in and stayed in. So they actually targeted the enemies of Thatcher's government more than they targeted their actual own ranks. Because, for example, if the paedophile ring had simply existed, so that the paedophiles with whom Margaret Thatcher knowingly surrounded herself like your name Michael Morrison, who was on the board of Ludgate Security, Ludgate Holdings, rather, the PR firm in Dolphin Square, before he became her main advisor, basically replacing Irene Neve. They had all these care homes in the north of Wales. If it was simply for her friends to abuse kids at will, they could have got some of these poor kids and abused them, some of whom we know now probably were murdered, because John Allen eventually was prosecuted in 1996, but there's various kind of stuff around that doesn't scan right. But in the novel, and I can't be 100% sure this happened, it's the two people who are compromised decisively are Grenville Janner and Cyril Smith. And of course, by the mid-1990s, Savile had been rewarded with positions of trust at both Broadmoor and Stoke Mandeville through Thatcher and through what's her name, the egg woman, Edwina Currie. And it's obvious that he was being rewarded for something. There was a guy called Simon Regan who during the 90s worked for Scallywag magazine, which is referenced in the novel. He exposed a lot of this stuff, how some survivors have been murdered in Brighton, and of course he both his editor and he himself were then killed or died under suspicious circumstances 1 year after Joel Dando, who I also believe was assassinated for exposing the paedophile ring. I think the bank coppers who were involved in covering out the Brinksmat robbery were calling in a debt on that one. But you read the novel and draw your own circumstances. Certainly, I think that in the early 2000s, I think that John Calder Palmer had tried to blackmail members of the paedophile ring, or maybe the victims of the paedophile ring, and he was killed for it. And I think that what's interesting is there was a Lebanese gangster based in Spain called Mohammed Demba, who actually made this claim in a book he was supposed to be working on, and then suddenly retracted it. And then Tom Pettifer of the Daily Mirror had to retract this argument, this claim that he'd also made. I think that Tom Pettifer was right. I think that is exactly what happened to Palmer. I don't think the Russian mafia gave a toss about him by that time. And in the meantime, of course, what had happened is that Grenville Janner had become associated with Jeffrey Epstein, and had introduced the power-hungry and ever-corrupt and I want to be a member of the establishment, Peter Mandelson, to people like the Russian oligarchs, and got them involved in massive investment of dirty money. By the late 1990s, I think the paedophile ring was more about manipulating financial markets than actually about manipulating politics, because New Labour was just a facsimile of the Tories anyway. They didn't care if Labour won an election. It didn't pose any threat. They did care about protecting their financial interests. Later on, about from 2005, you got the death of Palmer. Then the next thing that happens is that you get this false trial set up involving Carl Beach and Harvey Proctor, which leads Operation Midland, Zori Septiphel, on a false, basically on a wild goose chase. And once that's proved false, Daily Telegraph and other right-wing there never was a paedophile ring, it was all made up by Carl Beach. Carl Beach was not anywhere in the picture when Simon Regan was working the story in the 1990s. That's absolute crap. What did happen in the 1990s is a number of things happened in 1996. One, John Allen was eventually convicted of being a paedophile and quite possibly murdering children at the care homes in North Wales. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but he confessed right away, and there was no real trial. The investigation, the Gillings report, was actually basically sat on or undermined by William Hague when he was Welsh Secretary. A lot of the evidence that had been compiled in a care home in a warehouse in Crewe there was an arson attack, and the editor of Scallywag magazine was killed in northern Cyprus. And the fact of those three things happening within close proximity to each other, I find highly suspicious. But for more details, read the novel.
You spoke a bit about the going on from the 90s and the 2000s. What was the sort of context in which the deep state pedophile ring operated in the 80s and 90s?
Right, well, the two things that happened, I mean, well, I've gone into a lot of this detail anyway. The obvious thing is that by the 80s and 90s, it was no longer about replacing government, because unlike Harold Wilson, they weren't scared of New Labour. In fact, arguably, you could say they'd helped to create it. There is no evidence that when Granville Janner was brought into the, basically compromised as being a paedophile, that there was any operational link between that and the British American project, which was launched in the Ronald Reagan White House with Robert Maxwell present. That there any connection between that and the pedophile ring. What we do know, however, is that Granville Janner was part of that conspiracy to ensure a right-wing leadership succession in the Labour Party that eventually happened in 1995. And we also know that the News Corporation had knowledge, or had certainly heard rumours, that Jimmy Savile was a paedophile, as had Roger Cook of the so-called Roger Cook Report, who'd also buried the story. Well known for doing favours for MI5. Don't care if he hears me say that. It's overwhelming evidence it's true. Now, in later life, when Jimmy Savile had died, I can't remember, it was the editor of the News of the Daily or the Sun, but one or two of those two papers said, yes, we had heard these rumours, but we were frightened to follow the story up because we got sued. Well, I think News Corporation can afford to take that risk, and if you needed any more evidence, when Daniel Morgan was murdered in a South East London pub car park in 1987. News Corporation had enough resources to follow the BBC Crime Watch reporters who were actually investigating the story and trying to get as much possible on their private detectives working. They had a bunch of ex-SAS net breakers working for them. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to put Jimmy Savile under surveillance. So draw your own conclusion from that one. But the real big change in the 80s and 90s was that at this same time, Robert Maxwell, who had replaced Cecil King as the editor of the proprietor of the Daily Mirror, and his then associate Jeffrey Epstein, were involved in the theft, basically, of $58 billion from the then Soviet Union. In a criminal conspiracy that involved Alexander Kryuchkov, who was the corrupt leader of the KGB 6th Directorate, a man who saw no future in the USSR under Gorbachev, and who allowed what became the oligarchs, and with a little help from the Tambov Mafia, which of course at that time included Vladimir Putin, to pump all this money out of the Soviet Union and launder it through various kind of shell companies, some of whom had portfolios based at Deutsche Bank, which was already the Russian mafia's bank of choice. That led to the assassination of Alfred Herrhausen, the CEO of Deutsche Bank in 1989, but also through 200 shell companies whose portfolio was handled at Goldman Sachs by Robert Maxwell. Now, what was happening at the same time is that Robert Maxwell had basically miscalculated with his own financial transactions, and had basically bought the New York Daily News and had used his printer's pension fund to do this. So there was a £40 million black hole in his pension fund. And having been involved in this criminal conspiracy with a bunch of corrupt KGB and corrupt CIA and their criminal associates, and Mossad was dumb enough to think he could blackmail them out of another 40 million quid. Now, we did a World in Action story on this that covered most of it, and a bit more. And I had a ex-KGB asset who worked for me as he was one of my informants or sources. Sorry, don't call them informants. That's not kind. And who basically confirmed this, as did other sources to World in Action, to myself, to Gavin McFadden, and it's since been recycled by the Irish journalist Martin Dillon. This theft really did take place using something called Promise software, which is not described much in this book, but in another one I'm working on. And this theft of a huge amount of money, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, also led, of course, to Robert Maxwell's murder, after which all his business associates contacts were inherited along with his daughter by Epstein himself. This all happened at a time when, in a sense, the deep state paedophile ring in the UK and its American counterpart, which goes back to the 83 at least, when Epstein was already pimping for Donald Trump. And we've all read the harrowing accounts of Jane Doe 4 and the rest of it. This started to merge with the UK network, which still operated. Dolphin Square was still being used to abuse young boys, but now, of course, women were being trafficked into the UK from the former Soviet Union and from the former Warsaw Pact countries. And this was all happening at a time when Grenfell Janner moved in the same circles as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as his horrible wife, as Grenfell Janner, and the Russians are looking for places to invest money, and particularly in London's corrupt property market and in Britain's offshore banking system. And this, of course, you've got people like that. You've got Mandelson, who's played a major role in the rise of New Labour. He's a mate of Grenfell Janner. He ends up defending Janner and actually nominating him for a peerage when he's under investigation as a paedophile. And guess whose director of public prosecutions at that time? It's Keir Starmer. So years later, when Mandelson wants to undermine Jeremy Corbyn's prospects of winning an election and deliver a new right-wing leadership to the Labour Party and its capitulation to big capital, he brings together his little team, including people like Morgan McSweeney and Josh Simons, and performs this act of treachery within the Labour Party, for which he is rewarded with the promise that he will become the ambassador to a fascist America under Donald Trump. The whole thing about the relationship between Mandelson and Trump and Jeffrey Epstein is that he wasn't made ambassador to the United States in spite of his connection with Epstein and Trump. He was made ambassador because of it. And it was only when it was found out that all of a sudden they couldn't get rid of him quick enough. But the stench is still there, and it's why it's one of the biggest things that's bloody tainted Keir Starmer right the way through his career, and another reason why I'll be glad to see the back of him, quite frankly. But that's a big consequence of things that have happened. I believe that quite possibly Epstein was part of a wider conspiracy, and that in some form or other it still exists. But I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly how that works out now.
So why do you think the media was able to frame Jimmy Savile as this lone sexual predator, but wasn't able to do so with the Epstein files?
Well, I went through the mechanics of what happened specifically with Carl Beach, leading them on a wild goose chase in which Harvey Procter was a very nasty individual, by the way, and is an abuser of rent boys, was falsely, of course, he's a guy that left hates, was falsely accused of murdering a child was actually a false allegation, led the cops on a wild goose chase. And of course, once that was proved false, the rest of the media couldn't wait to say, oh, it's all made up by Carl Beech. However, the fact that they're able to get away with that is, quite frankly, down to something very simple, which is the corrupt relationship, a toxic relationship between toxic legacy media in Britain and the media, which is concentrated in so few hands that if it's run by people like Rupert Murdoch, and it's run by people like the Daily Mail Group, and it's run by the likes of these characters, they're not going to pursue a story that is going to undermine the establishment. They're going to bury it. And so Jimmy Savile's dead. If you can frame him as like, oh, it's all the BBC's fault or something like that, even better, because they want to privatise the BBC and took significant moves towards that at that time. So it's really all down to the fact that the media in Britain is bent. When it comes to the Epstein allegations, there's still been an attempt to frame him as a lone predator, but because investigative journalism has not been criminalised to the extent that the United States has in the UK, it just didn't work. And of course, all this stuff about his link to Iran-Contra, all this stuff about what he was up to before he got involved with Robert Maxwell, which actually led into that, and his relationship with Adnan Khashoggi and the Saudi Arabians, all this stuff is now public knowledge. The genie's out of the bottle. They can't actually put this back in. What they will try and say is that it all ended with Epstein. And what you've had quite interestingly in America is this Michael Wolff, who was quite happy to be part of Epstein's little entourage, suddenly playing kiss and tell and aligning with possible successors to Donald Trump, who is basically going to be dumped by the American deep establishment at some point, but only when they've got some right-wing fascist to take his place. We don't know who that'll be yet. Already making moves to say, oh, this is all bad, and it all happened under Epstein, and he's dead now, and let's put a stone over it and move on. But it's largely because the media in America are more robust when it comes to investigative journalism, unless it's Fox.
What does the two-tier banking system, or octopus, sometimes called the Epstein class, what does it say about power relations in late capitalism?
Well, let's explain what we mean by it. I mean, when there was a guy called Robert Booth Nichols, who was a corrupt CIA agent involved with various undesirables during the Iran-Contra period, who talked about a two-tier system. He was the guy who provided him and an Israeli agent called Rafi Eitan, who was basically a tech millionaire when he died in Israel much more recently. They provided this stolen promise software that Maxwell provided to Khrushchev and the KGB 6th Directorate to steal all this money from the Soviet Union. And he talks about a two-tier banking system. He said that, while the banking system had been deregulated, in actual fact you had cabals of bankers particularly in JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, who worked together as a kind of cartel, but also with their close links to the intelligence community, to ex-military who'd gone into the army, and acted almost like a kind of economy within the economy and a state within a state. That's really, and of course that was called the Octopus by a called Danny Casolaro, an investigative reporter in Washington State, who was murdered almost certainly by Booth Nichols in the same year as Robert Maxwell. And when people talk the Epstein class, this clique of people who are connected through corruption and through sexual abuse, they're basically this. I think they're the same thing. I think they've just been called different things at different times. And the only reason that can possibly exist is because capitalism is dying, and it's so centralised and so concentrated that you've got such a small elite of people. They all know each other.
Yeah.
Now, the danger when you talk about things like that, and I think this might be the last question you were going to ask, so I'll be a bugger and I'll preempt it, is how does that compare with some right-wing conspiracy theory about, oh, it's the Illuminati or it's the New World Order? basically, at the end of the day, when Cecil King set up a paedophile ring to establish a military coup in Britain in 1960, he was not thinking about, like, in future there being a new fascism based on tech oligarchs, and he wasn't thinking about people like Elon Musk. He wasn't thinking about people like Peter Thiel and all their little friends that they later got involved with. Not Cecil King, but Epstein, which means that it's not this planned conspiracy outside of history. The whole thing morphed in response to what was happening in the class struggle and then in capitalism after the working class faced its catastrophic defeats. And it changes its form and it changes its personnel, because it's not a conspiracy outside of capitalism. And it can only exist because capitalism is heading towards its end game, its death agony. You didn't have anything like this, particularly in the 1930s or before, well, certainly not under Victorian pre-monopoly capitalism. So it's a conspiracy in history. It's not a conspiracy theory of history.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important to actually, because it did bother me when I started writing the book that, you know, people who like believe in David Icke and QAnon and all this, you know, Alex Jones, people like that might latch onto it, and I am no supporter of their position whatsoever, and I just want to make that very clear.
Well, thank you very much for answering those questions.
Okay, it's been a bit of a marathon, but you know, I'm still here. Yeah.
And I think by the time this video goes out, the book should be out.
It should be out, indeed. Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, the first one, I think, Valley of Death will be out.
Yeah.
Sooner the better with the second one. But yeah, right.
And the links for that will be in the description.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, yeah. And bye for now.